Hello, everyone, and welcome back. My name is, of course, Michael Granado. I'm a history and philosophy educator. And in this video, I'm going to, I was trying to think about how I'm going to approach this. So, this video is based off of a section of my thesis. I'm currently a PhD student writing my thesis on Gaston Bachelard's philosophy of time. Now, this video has seemingly little to do with that. But as a part of my thesis research, I was researching the history of psychology, specifically about how the history of psychology relates to a branch of philosophy called phenomenology. And so my imagination for this video, my picture imagination for this video, my plan for this video was kind of to create a series kind of loosely tracking the development from what we would identify as psychology, kind of building up, leading up to the discipline of philosophy that we call phenomenology. And the two, I think, are clearly related. So I just kind of wanted to trace that. Now, a couple of things before we get started, because this is intellectual history meaning the history of ideas. And so it can be kind of overwhelming, the amount of information that you have to deal with in terms of the amount of authors and text reviews. So this is a very high level overview. And what I mean by that is we're not really delving into minutia here. We're kind of, hopefully, I'm going to kind of give you a big picture overview of the threads that I see running through this. And what I'm going to do is start with roughly the Enlightenment period and kind of build up from there. This will probably be a 2-3 part series. Build up from the Enlightenment to 19th, 20th century phenomenology, ending with a philosopher named Husserl, who we'll get back to. There's a reason for that. The reason for that choice of time period is that the history of psychology goes all the way back to the beginning of philosophy. The two are very closely related to each other. Philosophers, to be clear, psychology as a discipline didn't really distinctly develop until the 19th century, which we'll kind of get to in this video. But philosophers had been writing about the cognitive processes of the brain, have been writing about the nature of ideas and where ideas come from, and the relationship between the brain/mind and the body since there has been philosophy. So I'm not going to do the full history of the relationship between philosophy and psychology. That would be like a book level kind of research project. That would be multiple very long videos. There are some very good books out there on the history of psychology. One is called The History of Psychology. It's not called, not History of Psychology, The Story of Psychology by Morton Hunt. I'll actually link that in the description of this video. It's very cheap. I believe there might even be a PDF of it online. It's a thick book, it's a dense book, but that kind of would cover the full spec. And even Hunt it's an older book. So even that's not, it's only the history of Western psychology. Psychology as a discipline you can see emerge, especially in places like India, a very developed and distinct psychology, psychological method, and psychological theories as far back as like the 5th and 6th century BCE. But this video is not going to cover any of that because, again, although I've been rambling, I'm trying to keep it relatively short. So I'm going to start with the Enlightenment period. And I'm going to start with a person who deserves as much credit as any philosopher in history, maybe apart from like Plato, Aristotle, Confucius, or something like that. The modern philosopher who deserves as much credit as he gets, and that's René Descartes. But before I get to Descartes, let me kind of outline what I see the thread is within the history of psychology that connects it to phenomenology. So we have this distinction, this separation, so to speak, between different types of psychology that emerge almost from the get-go. You'll kind of see traces of this with what I talk about when I talk about Descartes, the separation really emerges with John Locke, as we'll see, and by the 19th century German psychologists slash philosophers, they're treating these two aspects of psychology as separate disciplines. Now, the terms I'm going to use here might vary from one philosopher, I'm just going to say philosopher. Okay, I'm going to say philosopher because prior to the 19th century, anybody who did any of the natural sciences were just called philosophers. So I'm just going to, for the sake of simplicity and not confusing myself, philosopher. So different philosophers use different terms, but we have this basic division. And this division is between what we can identify as physiological psychology. Sometimes it's called empirical psychology. I believe that Locke calls it empirical psychology. 19th century philosophers will call it physiological psychology. But physiological psychology on the one hand, and this is the psychology of kind of the relationship between the brain and the body. Now that sounds like a no duh statement because isn't that all psychology? But as we'll see, the blame here is on Descartes, but we'll get to that here in a second. So physiological psychology studies that relationship between brain and body, how the brain impacts, influences, and carries out bodily function. You got to think about this. With the Enlightenment period comes the development of modern medicine, modern physiology. They had a very detailed understanding of the human body, but in terms of the why question, like why, if I think to move my arm, why does my arm move? That proved to be a little bit more difficult because of the lack of the technical equipment that we had today. So, yes, they had a very strong understanding of physiology proper, but there was still this question of how all of this worked, specifically as it relates to cognitive functions and how cognitive functions relate to bodily functions. And so there are emerging theories and ideas, and we'll see Descartes' idea about how that worked here in a second. But physiological psychology or empirical psychology focused on physiological explanations. For example, the connection vessels at first or nerve endings to the brain and how the signals were sent from one part of the body to the other, and how different emotional states might send different signals, kind of those sorts of explanations on the one hand, and what was identified as cognitive psychology on the other. And cognitive psychology relates principally to mental functions, the cognitive facilities themselves, cognitive processes that don't necessarily have a physical correlation. What I mean by that is something like emotions. Yes, physical objects might make us feel certain types of, might give us certain types of emotional responses, but emotions in and of themselves seem to originate purely from the brain or the mind. And as we'll see with people like Descartes, you also have the development of this idea of innate ideas, that there are certain ideas that we gain knowledge of purely by thinking really hard about them. Ideas such as the idea of self, the idea of God, and like self reflection. So, and the idea is that each one of these branches of psychology had a different methodology, had a different way to approach it, had a different way that you would study it. For example, with physiological psychology, obviously you can like measure that, you can test that, you can conduct experiments on like reflexes and on the different senses. For example, you can do different experiments with experimenting with vision and how people viz things. I was about to say how people view things, right? You could carry out experiments around that. But with cognitive psychology, it was taken to be more rationalistic, more philosophical. And so the methods of inquiry were, in a lot of cases, non empirical, which is interesting to think about. But it's this division, as we'll see probably in the second part of this series, that's ultimately going to lead to some very interesting developments in terms of the development of Husserl and the development of Husserl, in terms of the writing of Husserl and the development of phenomenology as a philosophical discipline. But let's get started by starting in the Enlightenment. And first up, of course, we have the man, the myth, the legend, Rene Descartes. As I said before, Descartes deserves all the credit. Now, if you've gotten this far in the video throughout my rambling, I would here's my hot take, my philosophical hot take. Feel free to argue with me in the comment section. I would argue that Descartes is probably the most influential figure of the Enlightenment. Yes. I'm going to say of the scientific revolution too, even more influential than like Isaac Newton. So tell me why you disagree with me in the comment sections. Anyway, philosophical hot take over. So with respect to psychology, now Descartes is one of these people that is writing in basically every area of philosophy. He's developing an epistemology. He's developing a scientific method. If you read his discourse on method, he's doing like actual science and physics. You can look up his vortex theory. It's kind of an early explanation for what Newton would later identify as gravity. He's arguing for the place of mathematics and scientific explanation, Cartesian coordinates, of course, in mathematics. I mean, the guy is doing everything. But he's also one of the foundational figures of psychology, for good or ill. This might be one of the more controversial ideas that Descartes put forward, because Descartes is going to introduce this distinction. In philosophy, we refer to this as Cartesian dualism, this fundamental distinction that Descartes introduces between mind and matter. Now, I don't want to get too bogged down into this because even though we're talking about the history of philosophy, dualism is a position that people still hold nowadays. It's an active philosophical position. To give you a brief introduction to dualism, there are better videos out there on it. Descartes, that on the one hand you had the body, and on the other hand you had the mind, and the substance of each were fundamentally distinct and separate from one another. The mind, according to Descartes, is an immaterial thinking substance, and the body is a material, extended physical substance. But although they are fundamentally distinct from one another, they still interact with each other, right? We're still talking about the connection, even if we're going to call it mind instead of brain, we're still talking about the connection between mind and body, because in a very real way, we all know from basic experience that the mind can influence the body. We tell our bodies to move, right? So there is a connection. So with this dualism that Descartes introduces, we have this separation between mental and physical substances, and that's on an ontological, a basic level between mental and physical. But there are, of course, are ways in which the immaterial mind influences and interacts with the material body. And even though we have this interaction, what this means from a practical standpoint, from a methodological standpoint, is that there are different ways, different methods that we come to understand the body and the mind. Let's get back to that separation in psychology that I was talking about. There are different ways to coming to understand knowledge. With respect to the mental processes that Descartes is talking about, Descartes introduces this notion of innate ideas, clear and distinct ideas, that once you clear your mind, once you meditate on, once you rid yourself of external influences. See, for example, Descartes' meditation on first philosophy. This is supposed to be like an actual practice that you carry out. I have a video on that if you're interested, but that you come to understand that there are certain innate ideas in the mind that they're innate because you don't have to be taught them. No one has to explain these ideas to you. You just kind of intuitively know and understand that. And these innate ideas include, for example, not only the existence of God, but certain attributes of God, such as infinity and perfection. Other innate ideas include the essence of matter, kind of like intuitively understanding the extension of matter, as well as the essence of mind. And of course, famously in Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy, truth of the I, truth of the self. And so we can come to understand these cognitive, metaphysical truths not through understanding the external, but rather through understanding the mind itself and the cognitive processes of the mind. And this understanding will influence Descartes in a number of ways. So let's talk about Descartes' theory of reflexes, for example. And this kind of, maybe you'll start to see the separation that I'm talking about here. So let me blow this up so we can better read it, so I can better read it and you can follow along. So this is what Descartes says in his work titled On Man, published in 1662. And he's trying to give an idea about the origin and the nature of these are physical reflexes, why our body reacts to certain things. And this will also give us insight into the difference, for example, that Descartes says is between humans and animals. So let me read this quote at length. I'll summarize a little bit of it, actually. For example, and this is the drawing that Descartes gives to accompany, kind of illustrate what he's saying here. For example, if the fire A, the fire depicted here, is close to the foot B, the foot depicted here, the small particles of fire, what Descartes calls corpuscles, which, as you know, move very swiftly, are able to move as well as part of the skin which they touch on the foot. In this way, by pulling at the little thread CC, this is the thread in the body that runs from the foot all the way through the body. I don't know why the guy has to be naked, but naked people illustration. The thread CC that runs from the foot all the way up the back to the head, which you see attached there at the same time, instant open E. It opens like this little gate here towards the brain, which is the entry for the pore D, pictured there. I don't really know if you can see that, which is where the small thread terminates. Just as by pulling one end of the cord, you ring a bell, which hangs over the other end. Now, when the entry of the pore, or the little tube, has thus been opened, the animal spirits flow in it from the cavity F, and through which they are carried partly into the muscles which serve to pull the foot back from the fire, partly into those which serve in turn the eyes and the head to look at it, and partly in those which serve to move the hands forward and to turn the feet. Partial understanding of physiology, in that there's an understanding that there's a relationship between these kind of innate reflexes that we have, especially reflexes that we have to pain. Now, what's interesting about this is I mentioned the separation, the distinction between animals and humans. So there is there's a metaphor that's really popular in the early Enlightenment, mechanical metaphors, clock metaphors. And there's this comparison of animals, of living creatures, and sometimes even of humans to machines, that there's a way in which our body operates in a machine-like manner, in the sense that with reflexes aren't really something that you have to think about. It's just a boom, it's a natural reaction. Your body's kind of moving on its own. And Descartes will, in terms of animals who are obviously sentient, they're conscious on some level. Descartes wouldn't use the word conscious. They're sentient on some level. They're alive, they're moving around, they're reacting to the environment. That animals operate almost principally off of these reflex-like motions, and he'll call animals as a result machine-like. They're more machines than humans are. Well, what separates, according to Descartes, what separates the animals from the humans is that the humans have the ability to kind of step back. And the reason why we have the ability to step back is because of our mind. Humans have this dualistic nature, that separation between mind and body. And again, this is not my position, this is Descartes' position, have that separation that animals don't. Okay, and I have other slides here. What's up with this guy's face, Descartes? Like, What's going on there? Anyway, so after Descartes, we have the writings of John Locke. Now, Locke will fundamentally disagree with Descartes on multiple levels, on multiple things. Now, John Locke is an English philosopher, probably, I can't say best known. Locke's another one of these people that's writing about a wide range of subjects. One of the things he's really famous for, of course, is his political theory. If you are watching my video and you're an American, you are probably innately familiar with John Locke's political theory. It's the basis. It was deeply influenced on the American founding fathers. If you read, for example, the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident that among these are life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. That's taken almost verbatim from Locke, except for instead of happiness, it's property. Anyway, different video for a different day. Locke, a Renaissance man, is all I'm trying to say here. But Locke, during his time, got really popular because of a book that he wrote, an essay concerning the nature of human understanding. And in this, he'll kind of dive a little bit more deeply into psychology, into the nature and the origins of ideas. And Locke will fundamentally disagree with Descartes. He's combating Descartes' idea of innate ideas. If you don't know Locke from his political theory, at some point in your life, you may have heard of the phrase la tabula rasa, the blank slate. This is Locke's idea. So Descartes said that there are certain ideas that are built into our minds, ideas like self, God, extension slash matter. Locke will say that there are no innate ideas, that all of the ideas that we have, our cognitive faculties, come from the external world, come from our senses, that humans are born a blank slate, and that knowledge about the external world, knowledge about ourselves, is ultimately acquired through later on through sensory experience. So, an essay concerning human understanding, published in 1690, is a foundational text, not only in philosophy, but as well as in psychology. Delving a little deeper here, Locke is going to distinguish between simple and complex ideas, explaining that simple ideas originate from sensory experience or reflection. So my idea on the color of the wall is directly emanating from my visual sensation of the wall, for example. And complex ideas are ideas we form by combining these simple ideas. So, for example, I may not understand or have any knowledge of what like the wall of a spaceship looks like, but I can kind of get an approximation based off of all of the different walls that I've seen over. Why am I using the example of walls? I guess I had a wall, that's why it came to mind. But by combining ideas, I can get more complex ideas, even of things that I have not necessarily experienced by combining these other simple ideas that I have. It's with Locke that we also get this kind of famous distinction between primary and secondary qualities with respect to sensation. So, primary qualities exist independently of our sensing of them, if that makes sense. So, primary qualities would be things such as size and shape. The size and the shape of a rock exist independent of my perception of that rock. If a rock weighs 5 pounds, it weighs 5 pounds regardless of whether or not I've picked it up, as opposed to secondary qualities, which are dependent upon sensation or directly come from sensation, such as color and taste, are probably the most famous examples of that. So the clock, the clock. So the rock's color, for example, if the rock is dark gray color, the rock's color is based off of me sensing its color. So throughout this work, Locke is going to emphasize the importance of empirical observation and rational analysis, laying the groundwork not only for modern empiricism, but also modern psychological investigation. And it's also with Locke that we get further investigations into cognitive psychology, reflecting on the nature of different sorts of ideas. Locke, for example, will call attention to the difference between ideas that derive from external sensible objects and those ideas that come from the internal operations of our minds. These sensible qualities, as the name suggests, derive directly from sense data. Sensible qualities can include, for example, things such as taste, color, tactile sensation, as opposed to the second category, the internal operations, internal objects, which are derived from internal sense. And Locke says that the source of this internal sense, and this is a quote, that every man has wholly in himself. And these internal senses, kind of like Descartes suggested, would include things like our sense of self, our sense of place, and things like emotions. Okay, so from Locke, we move to what I'm titling the German turn. And this is a more of a historical shift that takes place directly as a result of Locke. Because what's going to happen, like I mentioned before, Locke's essays widely popular. His essay concerning human understanding, which is a book, not an essay. Locke's book was extremely popular. And what's going to happen in 1765 is the German philosopher Gottfried Leibniz. Is it Gottfried? I can never, these German names. I know that's a very common German name. I'm just going to say Leibniz. Leibniz will actually translate Locke's essays concerning human understanding into German and give kind of like a chapter by chapter commentary in the form of a dialogue. But by doing so is going to kind of bring Locke to a new German audience. Leibniz, like Descartes and Locke, Leibniz, probably one of the most underrated philosophers of the Enlightenment. Another Renaissance person, Leibniz, writing in the areas of all the different areas of philosophy, ethics, epistemology. Leibniz was also a mathematician. Leibniz, along with Isaac Newton, developed calculus. They developed it independently from one another, although Newton accused Leibniz of stealing his idea of calculus. Different story for a different day. Leibniz also, let me just throw this in there. If you look, for example, at Leibniz's correspondence with Samuel Clarke. Samuel Clarke was a British philosopher who was very close to Newton. Leibniz and Clarke have this back and forth, and a lot of scholars believe that Clarke is kind of serving as the mouthpiece, that Newton's kind of telling Clarke what to guide at some point. Leibniz will actually anticipate certain aspects of relativity theory. I mean, the dude is living in the future, so to speak. It's crazy, super interesting stuff. Anyway, Leibniz, incredibly underrated. Another way that he's underrated is his influence on psychology. And then this again has to do with his translation of Locke's book into German. Leibniz is actually more so a rationalist, so he's actually agreeing more with Descartes, who Locke's responding to, hence his translation and chapter by chapter refutation. But Leibniz is going to argue that rationality must involve more than induction from cognitive experience. It must ultimately rely on, going back to Descartes, these innate ideas and principles. And these innate ideas allow us to grasp not just how things happen to be, but also why they must be that way. That our mind, the brain, brings certain things to the table in terms of sensation, that our cognitive faculties actually play a major role in how we perceive and understand the world. Finally, and this is probably where I will end this video today, is Christian Wolff, another German philosopher writing in the mid part of the 18th century. Wolff was a mathematician, a scientist, and is regarded kind of as one of the important German philosophers between Leibniz and Kant. And we'll talk about Kant maybe a little bit in the next video. Kant, another polymath. But The reason why I want to focus on Wolff here is because he will kind of further explore that original division in psychology that I mentioned before. And the language that Wolff is going to use is this distinction between rational psychology on the one hand and empirical psychology on the other. Rational psychology, according to Wolff, involves the study of the soul and a priori reasoning and logical analysis. So we come to understand certain things through the mind, through logical reasoning, a priori reasoning that's happening that's prior to experience, reasoning that we don't need experience to rely upon. It aims to understand the nature, faculties, and operation of the soul and or mind by deducing principles from self-evident truths and metaphysical assumptions. So again, we have a distinction here of method. How do we understand the mind? How do we understand the cognitive processes of the mind? Through logical argumentation, rational principles, and metaphysical ideas, rather than, as we'll see with the second distinction, in empirical psychology. Anyway, rational psychology seeks to establish kind of universal laws. These are logically derived in the same way that mathematical, in the same way that like Euclid's principles of geometry are logically derived. The idea is that there are certain cognitive laws that can be rationally derived in the same way, that we can be able to establish universal mental laws, universal mental processes, independent of empirical observations. In fact, these universal laws would set the stage for the later empirical observations. So we got rational psychology on the one hand and empirical psychology on the other. So in contrast, empirical psychology is based on observations and experience rather than kind of deductive mathematical reasoning. Empirical psychology would involve the systematic collection of data and the analysis of data about human behavior and about mental processes. For Wolff, experimental psychology is a discipline which, quote, establishes principles about the soul. Now, when I say soul here, soul is can be another word for mind. There's not like a clear distinction. It's just a matter of language for a lot of these people. But empirical psychology establishes these principles about the soul or the mind through experience. The separation in the different approaches to psychology are the result of the method employed by the different disciplines. So empirical psychology interprets empirical data about conscious experience as rational generalizations concerning conscious processes. Rational psychology, on the other hand, is the science of whatever is possible through the soul and is established deductively, logically, mathematically, and not through empirical observation or empirical data. Okay, so that's where I'm going to leave this discussion. So again, kind of coming into the 18th, 19th century, we have this divergence between rational psychology on the one hand and empirical psychology on the other. There's going to be a major objection that the German philosopher, again, sticking with the Germans, that the German philosopher Immanuel Kant is going to give concerning whether or not cognitive rational psychology is even possible. We'll pick up there, and from there we'll talk about how later 19th century German psychologists will kind of introduce these further distinctions that will lead to the development of phenomenology in the writings of Husserl. Anyway, I hope that you enjoyed this video. Thank you for joining me in my weird, strange ramblings today. Let me know what you think about all of this in the comment section below, and I will see you all next time. Thank you.